Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Madam Minister of the Federal Republic of Germany, dear Carlos, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, Mr. Villani, MP, dear MPs, Rector of Paris, Administrator of the Collège de France, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the organizers. I think talk about artificial intelligence in the Collège de France in itself is a pretty good idea. And it brings up to a good time in France's history where we had to make certain difficult decisions, where we had to actually talk about difficult moments between the French government and its university representatives. But anyway, this was a place where they met and talked about the way forward. I heard what you said, Commissioner, and also what you said, Administrator. Following in the steps of Claude Bernard is important, and we will, of course, persevere in that line. I'm not far from there. Before anything else, I would like to thank all the eminent scientists and researchers who have accepted to be here yesterday. Some were already here yesterday. Some of them have been here this morning. So there are people from the universities, from startups, from industry, and they have, in fact, been keen to share their points of view without any sort of professional bias or cleavages, and work together to discuss these strategies. Artificial intelligence, and I think for somebody like myself who worked mainly in the area of philosophy and was therefore always impressed by mathematicians and scientists, well, artificial intelligence brings us back to the view that there are many different worlds that are possible. There's the idea that God calculated and made the best world possible for us. And therefore, there's a Promethean view that this allows us to come back to the way in which the world was made. And that is the capacity to actually make the same creation, use machines to perhaps get there faster and get off the path towards evil and get onto the right track faster to create the world. It is Promethean, because there is obviously an innate ambivalence. Of course, there is something absolutely wonderful that one should be able to go faster than the way God himself used, or the time he used to create the world. And it's a great honor and privilege that we should be able to actually even conceive of these concepts. And it's interesting that we should talk about us. Nobody wishes to be deprived of that faculty. But when you actually have to face it, everybody has to look at it with a certain amount of apprehension. There has to be a certain amount of fear, because that fear is one of being judged, consciously or unconsciously. AI, in fact, goes back to the middle of the 20th century. It was when calculation prowesses developed, data masses were exponentially increased, and AI became part and parcel of that process. It was a technological breakthrough, but it was also social, economic, and ethical. So it was a political issue, if you understand the term in its most essential way. And then for 15 or 60 years, this continued. Today, it is really on its track. There are new opportunities, there are new options, and we can choose whether we go down certain paths or not, whether we can open certain vistas or not. So we are already on that track that I talked about. We have to choose. We have to take certain decisions, given the fact that the technical and the social side is radical, and the economic as well. We have to take certain stances. And this is why I'd like to thank Cedric Villani particularly for this report. He had some 400 hearings that he talked about. He had discussions with France II, with also with the CNIL, with OPEST, and with many other participants. And with all that input, he has given AI a very clear position, which is no longer anxious making, but which has very clear-cut approaches. I'd like to thank the ministers who are present here as well, but also for their contributions from the very outset, because they have made it possible for us to actually come up with a strategy which I would like to share with you today. This strategy is not something which is going to be a top-down strategy. It's not something which is going to impose a view of artificial intelligence on anyone. It would really not be, there wouldn't be any point in that. And also it goes against the very essence of what artificial intelligence stands for. One of its very strengths is that it allows the multiple expressions of its being to be expressed. So this is a moment where there is a true democratic decision where the multiplicity of all the individuals and agents involved can truly express themselves. And we can therefore grow from that. So it's quite clear that we would have to look at technical progress and human progress in the same way, economic transformation and social transformation at the same time, and also succeed that the Promethean utopia does not get converted into a dystopia. And therefore, we must not give in to an European tropism, or almost a French tropism, which is to state that a perfect, complete understanding of the unwanted effects of an innovation are well known in advance, and therefore we have to reject it right from the beginning. This is something that we are known for. This is what we have done in the past, and we shouldn't give in to that urge. And therefore, I think the first thing that we have to agree upon is that we should not actually be afraid, and we should not refuse change. First of all, because change is afoot everywhere, and also because it can lead to better things, to innovations. Secondly, if I take the second idea that we should keep in mind, is that we shouldn't be too naive. We shouldn't think that innovation or technical changes, which we can't always understand conceptually, is necessarily going to be self-regulating and therefore will match general well-beings and values. That is not true. And we live in a world where there are continuous examples of excesses of one sort or the other due to these externalities and the fact that the idea of self-inhibition or self-control in a way, keeping in mind the overarching principle of well-being, is going to somehow prevail. I don't believe that is actually going to happen or is possible. So one must not be afraid, but one must not be too innocent or too naive. We've got to actually have a strategy where we can understand what we want with artificial intelligence. And this strategy has to be based on 4 main facts, and they are hugely inspired by Cedric Villani's report and what you have worked on together. First of all, we have to be in a position to build in France and in Europe to establish the AI ecosystem, particularly have a standard which would be a standard for research and development and innovation. Secondly, we should have a policy of open data so that in France we can come up with AI champions, or at least encourage them to develop further. Third area is to have a strategy concerning funding and financing. This has got to be public and private, in France and Europe. So this would allow us to step up our presence in some specific sectors and be on as competitive as possible. And fourthly, we've also got to think of this subject from a political and ethical point of view, think of the elements that make up this debate, but we've also got to think of those elements ourselves, because this would allow us to come up with a common understanding and with rules. So the first point that I talked was the innovation ecosystem, which is indispensable. There are many different technical breakthroughs these past few years that have influenced the sort of world we live in, particularly the digital breakthroughs. Sometimes France was slightly slow to get on the bandwagon, was lagging behind, but what I would like to say that being slightly late or slow to get onto that sort of ecosystem means that you're going to miss out on opportunities. And that means that from the very outset, you are likely to lose out and lose the battle. Therefore, it's important for the other ecosystems also to flourish if we get on that particular track as quickly as possible. We all wish AI to be successful. I know that I can be critical about our weaknesses in France. I understand our handicaps and our weaknesses. However, in this particular area, I think we have real assets. We have excellence in our colleges and schools in the areas of mathematics, engineering. I think the report's author is a perfect example of that. And in Europe, we also have real excellence, real know-how in these areas. French engineers have worked in many different areas, have helped in high-tech aeroplanes, space sectors, have contributed to the most advanced technology and theory. So we have that know-how, we have that knowledge. That ecosystem exists already in France. And in fact, it has already been truly attractive and convincing for many, such as Facebook, Google, DeepMind, and others who have either been here or come back here. And I'd like to thank them for that faith that they have. And we think that Samsung, Fujitsu, IBM, DBM have joined Google and Facebook as being present in France, and they will set up a whole network of laboratories and research centers, which is a fabulous asset. That asset is truly exceptional, and it's because of the French know-how and excellence that exists in that area. It comes from our laboratories, our research centers, from our universities, and from our different academic circles. And I'd like to thank all of you for them. But some of the people who are here, I had discussions with them yesterday, and some were almost worried about the fact that because of this ecosystem in France, our capacities to train and to develop these sort of talents are at risk. So we have to be cautious and guarantee that the ecosystem can continue to grow without in any way being made fragile. So we've got to take certain decisions. So we're first going to set up a national program for AI. It'll be coordinated by INRIA with the other research institutes that are partners and with universities, and it will bring together French scientists. We will also set up a network with 4 or 5 iconic establishments, and they will, in fact, cross the whole of France. Most of these poles already exist. Prairie in Paris, Saclay, DGO, and other centers of those sort, and we will develop them further. So we have an open network, a community all over France, which will be able to constantly coordinate and also set up other centers in Toulouse, in Grenoble, in other parts of France. This will be connected to the university research ecosystem. It'll really be the leading vessel in promoting research and will be indispensable for finding and mining new talent. It will get private funding, and I know that Minister is looking at good partnerships and balance in that area. And I would like to thank some of our private sector friends who have already said that they wish to invest in this area. This will allow us, therefore, to make it possible to bring in the best scientists, entrepreneurs from the world so that they can come and work in France for short periods or longer periods if they so wish. Now, turning to Europe, I would first like to talk about our relationship with Germany. Part of the funding will, in fact, concentrate on Franco-German projects because we already have this strong bond with Germany. We have to concentrate on training, and we must make sure that French universities continue to provide the right sort of support for the ecosystem to grow. The first issue with AI is to find the right sort of talent. That is the challenge. We are, as I said, we have assets. We are attractive because we are less expensive than others. But of course, this nucleus of talent can, in fact, dry up. And so we've got to be careful. We've got to train the right sort of engineers, the right sort of PhDs, doctors, and others, so that we can actually continue with developing the talent and also drawing in new young talent. This is why we will double the number of students going from bachelor's to the doctoral level in AI. And we will make sure that that number is doubled. If France wishes to keep its position, it also has to shine abroad. I talked about this earlier on. This is why we've got to have individual chairs so that we can actually attract the best researchers. And we've also got to call up for new projects, like our Make Our Planet Great Again initiative, which was consolidated by the CNRS. This allowed us to actually send out and call out for projects. We got the best projects possible, and they were funded in many different ways so that we could fund the best sources of research. So we find the best researchers and university professors. We actually fund part of their career, and also we draw and attract as many of the best students so that we can make sure that France is one of the most attractive pool. This is the way that we can actually guarantee our future industry. And it is therefore, it's very important that we also manage to establish a closer link between universities and industry. It is a porous boundary or frontier that exists, which has got to be permeated more closely. In the new law, the PACT law, which is going to be presented by the Ministry of Economy and Finance, we will be working with the Ministry of Research, and therefore it will make it possible for a public sector researcher to spend at least half their time working in the private sector. Today, it's 20%. And this, therefore, can lead, and I've seen this in the discussions that I've had with various people, this unfortunately means that too many scientists actually go to universities in the US or the UK, which actually gives them that flexibility. And many of them said it was because of that flexibility that they took those decisions, because it is in a way a form of cross-fertilization. And if we manage to have this cross-fertilization between the sectors, then I think we will be able to go much further. People, in fact, frequently feel that they're always linked to their universities or to their research centers. And that remains even when they actually work partially in the private sector. And I think that's something that we have to preserve as well. I also feel that this particular ecosystem, the AI ecosystem, be adapted to our present-day challenges. So there's got to be more room for experimentation. You have said that yourself, Mr. Villani, and we too feel that we need to improve the speed of action in the experimental levels and areas, especially if we wish to innovate further. It's also important in France when you're testing an innovation, whether you're talking about an algorithm and its effects, or if you're testing a new drug, well, that time can be actually very long. And I know that the Minister of Health feels strongly about this as well. And because of those lengths and lead times, it means that innovation is quite difficult. This is why what we're going to do is send out an appeal for experimentation and find the right sort of legislation which will make it possible to, in the pact law that we're going to be passing, be able to actually move faster. If we're dealing with AI, if there are improvements in the different experiments that are possible, we could actually look at them more closely so that we can adapt some of the conditions concerning these lead times and experimentation periods. We will completely renovate the France experimentation program. This will become a permanent program and will be included in the portfolios and missions of each ministry. This means that innovation will become part and parcel of the government's missions. And in this way, artificial intelligence will really be integrated. And after all, it's a wager on how human intelligence can, in fact, adapt to innovations and taking risks. It is in this way that we will be able to get onto the world stage and compete on that world stage where China and the United States are already very active. And if we can develop this in France and in Europe, well, then I think we will be able to go very far. And in our next budget and also the discussions we have in Europe, I would like this to be taken into consideration. The second area we should concentrate on is data. Now, you've talked about how important this is. The Commissioner as well spoke about it. And that, again, is an area where we have a certain edge. We have massive centralized data centers, which allow us to be right on the forefront of AI in many areas. In fact, sometimes we are criticized for that. People feel that we're almost Jacobian. But it has some advantages. Because of that, we have clear-cut structures. And in these sort of circumstances, it could almost be an opportunity. So we should seize that opportunity. And to be able to process the data properly, we are going to be proactive in making our data open. This means that public data has to become open and accessible. We are also going to widen the scope of the public data services. This means that we're going to make sure that data will be available and accessible. In the previous government, the framework of this was set, but now we've got to actually work on the nitty-gritty, and the Secretary of State will be working on this subject, on making data accessible and open, and define the framework. We will also open this using data which will be financed through public finances. This will be for health data, but also data that will come from any research areas which have been funded by the government, also in transport, or anything that comes from the Open Science Program, which has been funded by the Minister, Frédéric Vidal. So this means that for projects which have been funded through the taxpayers' contributions or through public money, we would make the data available more openly and easily. And finally, we will also make it more accessible to have shared data platforms between the private and public sectors for specific subject areas. It's important for data to be shared in a more complete manner. And in fact, the value of these data sets increase proportionately faster or greater. So what we have to do is we have to convince those areas or sectors to open up to their counterparts and in fact, by doing so, their business models, their competition, their actual partnerships can develop much more. This is important in many different areas. Think of the agricultural sector. We can actually go much further. We can again have real disruptive technologies, and we can actually share data between the SMEs that are spread out. And if we share the data, they will be able to model the data and use AI to go much further in improving farming techniques. So this means that we are ready to support any of the initiatives which allow this open access to data. Banking data, for example, of transactions, the agricultural sector for the efficiency of pesticides, and also the area of automatic cars. In all these areas, data will be accessible. And we will also be promoting free software wherever we can, and what we have been able to develop in the past few years, and open software. And also, I think that we also have to open up at a European level the access to data, again, particularly when we're talking about access and the collection of data in specific sectors. In some areas, we have, in a way, sum of data, and the sum of data can be actually multiplied because part of this is really part of a collective good. So it's got to be used for research, but also can have fallouts on advantages in research and in other areas for everybody. Obviously, this means that we've got to have a framework which protects private data and makes it possible for the data to be used fully in Europe and for Europe. We have seen that public opinion and the general public is very aware of this issue and how private data is used. And I think that is legitimate because we are at a turning point. And we see that in different countries, including countries that truly believe in freedom, including in those societies, the question concerning the protection of individual data and confidentiality is an issue that is being discussed. So obviously, we will open up data, as I have said, but within a framework, and we've got to define that framework. One of the challenges of AI is, first and foremost, is not to actually confuse using aggregate data and intruding into data. This means we've got to have clear-cut regulations without having huge scientific breakthroughs. You can have all sorts of data. We saw that this morning talking about the medical sector. You can have a lot of data, but at the same time, it is anonymous. So this keeps confidentiality. So this morning, you could see that that could be extremely positive in the area of medicine. But if it's not protected in that way, it can be very detrimental in the area of insurance or job creation or seeking or in other areas. It can cause discrimination. As of May next year, you, Commissioner, talked about the regulations which will be introduced. And I think that is, in fact, keeping with what we've talked about. This is like the GDPR. But I think we've got to go even further. And this means that ultimately what AI does and what we're doing is really talking about controlling our own lives, controlling our existence. Each of us wishes to be masters of our own data, and that would be the right approach. And that is the only way in which we can accept the development of AI. This is why the next stages of regulations should allow us to be open, but at the same time make that each individual's data is protected and that each individual has the mastery over their own data. Make sure that the data is being used in a sincere and honest way. And this allow, therefore, industry to develop, for example, or different sectors to develop in a fair and honest manner. Once we have data, we also have to make sure there's European sovereignty. we've got to decide where the data is going to be processed. Who's going to decide how the data is going to be accessed? Are the regulations going to be regulations that we can control? These are subjects that are real issues that are being raised already. And when we're dealing that, we are talking about European digital sovereignty. That's what it's all about. When you're dealing with tax issues, regulations, laws, individuals operating on this area, users, all of this means that given the fact there's an economic and financial fallout, you've got to look at the territorial effect. And this is what we are actually looking at. Without perhaps having a holistic approach, we've still got to sort this out. Every time, whether we're talking about tax, when we talk about the large organizations like Google or Amazon, we mention these issues. But the real framework goes much further. And this is because it is worldwide, it's global, because the business is global. The consequences, however, remain national or European as far as we're concerned. And therefore, that framework should also be national and European. Regulation should also be national or European. That is what we've got to work on in the next few months and years. And therefore, the strategy that I'm presenting to you shows that part of it is not quite complete. France can't work on this alone. And that is what I am hoping to promote further when we have discussions in Europe. And just when we talk about artificial intelligence, here once again, one area which is a key area is health. We know that diagnosis or protocols or drug administration is in fact hugely changing, and through AI we will be able to actually able to have a preventative approach to pathology. We will be able to have individual tailor-made medicine. We will be able to change the quality of our lives, our longevity. All these changes are radical, and they're going to affect every single level of medicine. And this morning at the Curie Institute, we heard about some of them. For example, you could have early detection of tumors. You can also have immunotherapy. You can develop all sorts of certain therapies using molecular technology, which was considered up till now uncertain. All these areas, in fact, can be radically improved through AI, and allows us, therefore, to come up with bespoke medicine, which would be more preventative. And therefore, it would be possible for us to give extreme advantages and well-being therapy for our patients. But in this area, as I said, we do have a huge advantage over many others. Our health system is centralized. Our health insurance system and the hospital data is centralized as well. And this is something which is a great advantage. At the Curie Institute this morning, we heard about this. Through AI, it is possible to determine certain pathologies, and we can actually treat tumors, but also arrhythmia, cardiac arrhythmia. It's also possible, for example, to help radiologists. We can identify medical errors, which are, of course, rare, but which can occur from time to time. AI, therefore, will not in any way replace a doctor, a human doctor, or a researcher or scientist, but it allows us to work on all these areas in an extremely rapid manner. And this is why I feel we should even go further than this and try and use all we can from the research that is available for research. In 2018, we set up the Institute for Medical Research data. This allows keeping anonymous data, but an access to processing the data which is available there. This is in keeping with the spirit that I've talked about earlier on. And I would like to have the same sort of hub for medical health data, which will allow us to constantly improve the national health data collections It would better allow us to understand clinical trials, also information from insurance companies, but also from hospitals and general dispensaries. This hub will allow us, in a very secure manner, and in a completely confidential manner, to have an area, a space where AI can operate and help us to step up the innovations that I spoke about earlier on. So all the French research centers would also be able to work with this, in RIA, CNRS, INSERM as well, and the Medical Data Center will continue to be a guarantor for protecting data, medical data, because of course that's indispensable. If we cannot guarantee total confidentiality of medical data, we will not really be responding properly to French citizens' expectations. So by opening all of this up to research, I'm sure we'll be able to work on the medical breakthroughs of tomorrow. And it is in this way that we will be able to guarantee for France fair industrial and economic return. And this brings me back to what I said earlier on about sovereignty. It's very important that in our criteria for openness, we should have the sort of innovations that are required in France and Europe, but we also have to create value and get that creation of value, because otherwise it would be ridiculous, because we could say we've got these wonderful assets, we're going to be working and helping research, we're going to generate jobs, but these jobs are going to be at the other end of the world. That's not possible. You've got to be realistic, and that sovereignty issue or principle that I talked about, of course, affects the economic and financial side of things too.
This is a challenge that we can definitely overcome, and I hope that we do it in the coming months. We are really on the edge of deep revolutions and breakthrough, and we see that technological innovation needs to be supported by an incentive and regulatory framework. The government has a very significant role, of course, and I am determined to not hinder these technological evolutions by adapting or not adapting sufficiently our regulation. That would be the worst thing to do. So I'd like the exact opposite of that. I would like for the state to be able to support the actors of this transformation, to think its framework, and to organize, and I'll come back to this in a minute, continuous, transparent democratic debates on all of the consequences of these breakthroughs. So together, we will open our data, as well as the different sectors, to AI. But at the same time, we will open our society, which loves this, to all the debate and all the polemics against AI. And now the third main part of our action is the regulatory and financial, national as well as European frameworks. So regulatory framework first and foremost. Beyond these data opening processes, we need to set the emerging conditions that are adapted to these horizontal cross-sectorial evolutions for finance, for aeronautics, as well as many other sectors. We will have to increase the impact of our regulatory framework to help support the emergence of these platforms, as well as define the rules and regulations. And here I'd like to take an example and show you how the government can, on this issue of regulatory framework, truly stand alongside innovation. It's the example of self-driving cars. Let's acknowledge that so far France had been lagging behind in terms of experimental and development for self-driving cars, and I think this is precisely an example to fill this gap between us and the other leaders. France is a leading country in terms of car construction historically. And at the beginning of the 80s, our German neighbors took better choices and made better choices and decisions than us, and so took the lead in that area. But we can take back our position thanks to self-driving cars and thanks to namely defining the appropriate framework. We can redefine ourselves. We can redefine ourselves with the mechanical aspects, but also the software aspects and the smart mobility aspects of self-driving cars. This is why in April we will develop our action plan, thanks to Maria Dracht, whom I should like to thank. And we will reposition France at the forefront of self-driving cars. And as early as next year, we will have new level 4 experimentation that will be a part of our new law. By 2022, we will have a specific regulatory framework for the circulation of self-driving cars that will be implemented. And eventually, I wish to start as soon as possible setting the certification for self-driving cars for both the private and the public sector. Why? Well, because this movement, this momentum of self-driving cars requires a learning phase, and we need to work hand in hand with regions as well as constructors and users. We will be experimenting on in certain regions that will be voluntary regions. We will have an exceptional regulation framework for those areas, and hopefully we will have stakeholders to be working with on these topics that are at the heart of our test systems and mapping together this new innovation. We will have a strategy for France, but ultimately this will have to be a Franco-German and then a European action plan. The future is really in our hands. If we do what we did 20 years ago, France and Germany will walk on different paths and become competitors. And who will win? The winners will be the Americans and the Chinese. So we have an option to that, which is to work together, define common norms, define common standards, define a real mapping of our regulatory frameworks, our regulations, and our values. And this is at least what I will be suggesting. On a European level, we need to establish these rules and this framework for the development of these self-driving cars. It should be at the heart of our new digital strategies. It's not just about a common market with 27 countries. It's 27 common standards. It's the normalization of our rules for Europe. It's the one and only way to define our collective choices. We have done so in the past, and the time has come to do so again. Otherwise, we will simply have to watch as the world moves along. And when I say the world, I mean either our American competitors or other private sector stakeholders who are mobilizing to become the best competition for tomorrow. So we really, really want to focus on this regulatory framework idea. And we also need to be very strong and very proactive in the way that we do. There will be a 10 billion euros fund that will be made available by the end of the year. The Minister of Finances, as well as the Minister of Higher Education and Innovation, will allocate 100 million euros for startups and companies working in AI. 70 million euros will be allocated each year through the BPI, the Investment Public Bank, to startups that work on deep technology in the country. Our investment for future investments, 400 million euros, will be dedicated to innovations as well as industrial projects dedicated to AI. So that's a total of 1.5 billion euros that will lead directly to 500 million of additional private investment that will be allocated to support the emergence of this major hub of AI. What is key? Beyond these policy choices that we're proud of, the key is to make sure that these choices and the visibility be given as soon as possible to public and partnered research, as well as to support innovative research, private investment, to have a real multiplier effect behind these choices that we make in the terms of policies. I also should like to add 800 million euros that the state will allocate by 2024 for nanoelectronics. And I know that many here in this room are very much attached to this nanoelectronic AI ecosystem. Now, it goes beyond these French choices are the next choices in terms of regulatory frameworks. And Mr. Commissioner, you know that France will support your propositions. I genuinely believe that we need a European budget that will preserve all of the ambition of these historical policies, but we also need novelty in terms of innovation and disruptive innovation, which is why when I talked at the Sorbonne, I suggested that we start the equivalent of DARPA, but for Europe. And I also supported the report that you presented a few months ago. It was at the beginning of this year. In this report, you suggested to finance disruptive innovations for in terms of administrative terms, and to support ambition and organization. And you know that France will support this, because it's the only condition of the fulfillment of this emergence. In addition to all of that, the state determines the regulatory framework, the state and the government finances, and Europe will stand by the government. And we need to make the most of what AI offers, what AI hides in terms of education, training, job policies. We are standing before a revolution, and this revolution through AI will allow to improve the link between supply and demand, to improve the link and the adaptation of the training system to the job sector. And it will also eventually help us solve a certain number of negative externalities of these technological disruptions. And this is precisely what we need. We want to convince our fellow citizens that these AI evolutions are not particularly negative. Well, if we want to do so, we need to show them that these innovations also trigger well-being for them and not just problems for them. So long as we keep viewing innovations as job destructors in traditional sectors, localized, on the ground, then AI will remain a source of great fear. However, if with AI, with these stakeholders, with the startups, if we figure out a way to show that we will be able to predict the loss of jobs in certain regions, but also predict the emergence of new jobs because of new skills required in these regions, if we show that AI will help us redefine and shift the goals of our training systems, create new jobs, help provide new skills for new jobs in areas that already exist, but that we can translate in our policies, then we will completely change the way that people look at these innovations. We will change the way that they relate to AI, and we will change their whole experience with them. And that's another one of the challenges that lay ahead of us, on which we definitely need to overcome in these areas. And this dynamic, this momentum, we will have to keep using it. And Emmanuel, the Secretary of State in charge of these issues, will keep developing these thoughts with a national mobilization that he will be in charge of, and a national strategy that will do a case-by-case study of the policies that will be necessary. And then the fourth main chapter of the strategy is to define the ethical and political challenges of AI. I have thoroughly discussed the promises of AI, the massive support that France and hopefully Europe will give to AI. And I have also emphasized enough the economic, scientific, social challenges that this represents. But AI is really nothing but the project that it serves. Those who program AI determine what AI will do based on the data that serves as the input. And this is what determines the model of AI that we want to see emerge. And ethics, by design, is what will determine the AI of tomorrow. And nothing would be worse than to give the choice of ethics to private companies, for example. So when we talk of ethics in AI and policy and political choices in ethics, we talk about the implication, the implicit idea that we need to make deep choices and ethical choices. And as I was discussing with a few of you yesterday, in my view, we face three rather classic challenges when we find ourselves with such evolutions and revolutions. First, a conflict between values and techniques. Second is a certain conflict geographically speaking, and then a time conflict as well. So this is something that we know quite a bit about. And this is the thought process that we want to follow. The conflict between value and techniques. So long as techniques support common good, then there is no such thing as a conflict. When I was talking earlier about this individual predictive medicine coming from this startup, there is no conflict, there is no problem. The problem occurs when the very users don't respect collective values, collective preferences that unite us. And so using French data to allow an improvement of healthcare in France, of course, won't be an issue to anyone. But if one day this startup is based in another country, which does not follow either French legislations or European, and have completely different beliefs and values, then that's when a problem arises. So the idea is that before these technical choices, we will have to make a certain number of choices of values, and we will have to set these goals and respect them. We have already started discussing them in contemporary debates on confidentiality, on privacy, and the difference between private and public life. But there are other issues that will arise, and we will have to make choices, express ourselves, choose our preferences, and for that we will have to discuss these issues. We need to keep believing in our democracy and in the democratic power of these innovations. We need to set together our preferences. We need to figure out how we can articulate techniques and our values, but we also need to make sure that these technical evolutions never tamper with our democratic trust and our trust in our democracy. Because if the day comes that a president of the republic cannot no longer explain to his fellow citizens the evolution of AI, then it's a problem. It's a problem for democracy. The fellow citizens will think, who's in charge? Is it the people that we elect, or is it not? So to solve this problem and to prevent this problem from ever occurring, we will need transparency and loyalty. Transparency, first, means that the key to preventing these issues is to make all public algorithms transparent, make all algorithms public, trace their bias, not allow them to have the monopoly on decisions, support them constantly, and monitor them constantly. This is something we will have to do in the coming months and year. And the transparency I talk about also implies a constant interaction between AI and human beings. It also implies continuous debates, continuous improvement. If you decide to have access to a university, to a training program or a job, and make an algorithm in charge of all of these, then you need to make sure that this algorithm is loyal, that this algorithm is transparent, fully transparent, and you need to make sure that there is space for a debate around these rules. Otherwise, we put the algorithm in charge of deciding what the democratic priorities are for our society. So this topic needs to be at the heart of research in the INRIA research program. I am definitely in favor of having a lab open for this very purpose, and there needs to be a link between human sciences and AI. And constant discussion between these departments raise the question of the ethics of use of AI, and bit by bit create the code of ethics around AI. We need to commit to non-discrimination in social matters, sexual, racial matters, and the government will have to disseminate all of the algorithms and make them public, all of the algorithms that are used. And it will be the case for Parcoursup as well. All the algorithms will have to be public. I see that some of you have already applied for candidacy at the beginning of March, already expect the results and want to see the level of intimacy and privacy of the algorithm. Hopefully they will be able to circumvent the algorithm. Well, essentially, we will have to make these algorithms public, and it will imply dialogue, and dialogue is essential. And more widely speaking, broadly speaking, I wish to have an European and international debate on the certifying system for these algorithms so that Europe remains a space of liberty and progress, maintaining the either making private the use of AI and protecting the people from public decisions to be completely overtaken by algorithms. This is also a topic that I'd like to discuss on an international platform, specifically with our Canadian friends, because I know how committed they are in this topic. And at the beginning of April, we will have a discussion with that. And I'd like to have some sort of an IPCC for artificial intelligence, having a sort of group of experts that would be independent and able to really have a sense of the evolutions and organize democratic debates in a very autonomous, independent manner, and to feed the democratic debate that we will be needing. In addition to the topics that already exist, tomorrow we'll be talking about the independence of research. We'll be talking about algorithms, but also anything that has to do with AI. So the governments, the public authorities will have to invest in that and keep safeguarding the independence of the global debate around these things, which is why I'd like to have the IPCC of artificial intelligence. It will be the guarantee that we will safeguard our democracies and make sure that technology does not become a controlling body. So finding and striking the right balance between these values and these technical choices mean that we will need to add these issues in our education and do this in a transparent manner. And we need to add these things in our education, make sure that there is no such thing as a hijacking of these issues of artificial intelligence and algorithms by a group of happy few. It was true before, it is true with AI. I have a lot of respect for the people who work hard on these topics and who are sometimes talented, sometimes lucky enough to create these innovative breakthroughs, but it's sometimes a matter of not only business choices, it has to be a matter of society choices. This is why I ask for a code of ethics and for ethical choices. We need to make sure that there's a certain level of diversity among the stakeholders that will be able to make certain decisions. So we need to make sure that there is that the stakeholders don't look like me, white males in their 40s. We need more diversities. I have noticed that in this sector, a lot of people look like me, white males in their 40s, trained in European or American universities. So we need to go find other types of people, more women, more social diversity. And we really have to integrate this idea of diversity in the challenges that are upon us. Because the deep choices of tomorrow will be made by those that are in charge of these algorithms as well, and we need to work on not having too much concentration of talents.
And finally, as I said, we've also got to be dealing with the question of balancing geography and time. As I've said many times before, it is a global phenomenon. Research is a global phenomenon as well. And everybody who's working in this field is also global or international. And sometimes there are real concentrations which almost make us feel as if we've got monopolies. But the sort of values that are being shaken up by AI remain national or regional. That is a fact. And this is the first time at this speed we have economic and industrial innovation and radical, deep changes taking place without countries or states, sometimes even circumventing states and not having their own regulatory framework. And so this particular discord or tension is going to appear. And I think in our discussion on AI, we have to talk about this question of sovereignty. What do I mean by sovereignty? It means autonomy. It means the capacity to be able to choose the sort of standards that you are going to be subjected to. And if you give up sovereignty de facto because you say it's a global phenomenon, and therefore, in any case, the question of territoriality doesn't actually apply, well, then you are accepting that the daily rules of the game that you are subjected to are decided by somebody else. And therefore, there is no more autonomy or independence in your decisions. And I think when you're dealing with autonomy and sovereignty in democratic systems, and I think really they are the best, and nothing better has been invented, it is the most bottom-up process, and it's the people who decide. So I think it's important for these trends and changes also to have a strong democratic base, have rules concerning how transparency and fairness, but also how these questions concerning regional and national preferences be preserved. So here, once again, we should start having these sort of discussions. And this brings me to the last point, and this concerns the other area of tension or discord. This concerns the concept of time. And I have to conclude on this. Given how fast things are moving, I have just had myself a little bit of time to see and understand. But 40% of our population doesn't have access to this technology or is afraid of it. And we can't make enlightened democratic choices if we remain in that situation, because a large majority of our population is not actually ingesting and understanding these issues, and at the same time are being subjected to its effects. And this is why all of us, whether we are economists or sociologists or politicians or scientists, we've got to find the balance in that area. Because every day we feel we are Prometheus, but as Rambo said, the harsh reality is that we are down to earth and we are peasants. And in fact, Prometheus has a very sorry end when he forgets that he has his feet on the ground. And I think that when you forget your neighbor or your fellow man, you are not really doing that well, because we live with our fellow men or women. And I think, therefore, when we're dealing with these sort of innovations, we've got to remember that. Obviously, we have to also invest in understanding technology through education and distributing technology more clearly. This is what we started doing last year from kindergarten onwards, training her children to understand these technologies. We're also going to be training children and students on digital philosophies and ethics. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I have spoken for a long time, but you asked me to discuss this subject, which is vast. And now I think we've got to a phase which allows us to be both masters and owners of nature, which is a Cartesian approach. What I have proposed to you today, based on the research and thinking of many of you who are present here today, will constantly be appraised. It is not something which is fixed or vertical. In 6 months or in a year's time, again, we'll have to have another look at it. We'll have to move it around. But the 4 pillars that I spoke about are our 4 basic beliefs, and allows us, therefore, to concentrate on our thinking, our investments, on the laws that we're going to draw up, and the commitments that France are going to make. And I hope, truly, that we will also have Europe working with us so that artificial intelligence can really be developed throughout our continent. We would like France to be one of the leaders, the champions of AI. I think you've understood the message. But we want Europe to be the champions as well. We have the means, and now we have to create the conditions that will enable us to get them. It's good for our country. It will create new opportunities as well. And also because I think there is no way of wanting to control the negative side of AI or technology if we've missed out from the very beginning in this whole adventure. And this is why I want us, from the very beginning, how to excel in research, in training, in industry, and we will do everything, I will do everything, so that France will be the area where people can actually have open, honest discussions and exchanges about these subjects so that artificial intelligence can be thought through, its role, its consequences, and its role in society. That is the best way in which we can define the society we want to live in. Thank you for your commitment. And as you have all understood, you can count on me. I've said this here with the full understanding of the facts so that we can lead to the real renaissance that France and Europe needs.
Merci à vous, merci Samy. À vous de jouer maintenant.
Thank you. Now it's up to you.